Hey folks, so today I want to talk about accelerationism. I had a weird relationship with accelerationism. There was a time where I was very much into the philosophy, was always thinking of my default position was just going all guns blazing and reaching that ideal end state, right? Because there will be a kind of an end state where still the universe is boundless, right? Potentially boundless, though there'll be, no, not to get into that, but there'll be mechanical things that we'll be doing past a certain point, but we'll have achieved every single goal that we could potentially write. Like we'll have solved disease, we'll have solved death, we'll have acquired all knowledge there is to acquire, we'll have created every single piece of useful technology that you could create with the laws of physics that we have. We would have basically done everything that the species, our drives would be pushing, drives are pushing us towards, right? And that end state could be like millions of years into the future. It could be a few 10,000 years into the future. If you're like but if in a different timeline, humans could have become Buddhist. Like I don't want to use a religious term when I said Buddhist, but I just mean someone who's content with the way things are, right? Deeply content with the state of being, or the Buddhist default philosophy is to not change the world outside of you, it's to change the inner world and attain perfection in the inner world. And that's the ideal, that's the nirvana state, right? That's the enlightenment state. And you could have imagined that might have been the entirety of our species. In that case, we could literally have attained that end state for our species within a matter of a few centuries, right? But that's not the species that we are. We obviously want to explore the universe, we want to solve death, we want to solve disease, we want to acquire all you. So you can imagine, millions of years in the future, tens of thousands of years in the future, they'll kind of reach an end state of civilization, of human society. We'll still do things on the mechanical level, we'll still be exploring, the universe is boundless for all intents and purposes. There might be millions of intelligent species that we might want to make contact with in the broader universe, but we'll have attained, we'll have solved death, we'll obviously have solved disease, we'll have reached the culmination of our current drives, right? And all that will remain is iterations, right? Just basic iterations. And the end state. Okay, so back to my point with accelerationism, right? Accelerationism is this philosophy of, well, accelerating our path from where we are to that particular end state. There are obviously lots of, I was still bought into this philosophy, right? I wouldn't say I was religious about it. I'm not being really religious about anything, well, with exceptions. But I don't think I was super religious about it. I wasn't blinded by it, but it did appeal to me on so many levels. But then when you take a step back, when you start looking at it from various angles, you realize, that, oh, you know what? It's just so full of holes, right? But most philosophies are, right? You can poke holes with literally everything. And accelerationism is not an exception, right? There are some pretty major holes. Right? One of the biggest ones is that, sure, there are some converging themes when you ask culture A, when you ask group B, nation A, group C, etc. You'll get different answers of what we want, but at the highest level, we still want the same things, right? Like we want great social lives, family lives, we want to explore, we want to create, we want to have fun, right? Like there's some basic things that we want to attain. If you were to ask the creme de la creme of our species, again, the highest level goals of our species, right? These are not goals that your average Joes and Janes would care about. These are goals that your Newton or your Dawkins or your Hitchens would care about, right? And I just realized that yeah. So I refer to these goals. These goals are obviously acquiring all possible knowledge of the universe, right? Figuring out how everything works, inventing every single useful thing that can be invented, right? Those sort of things. And at some point we'll get there. But leaving that aside, there's still, if you were to ask an American about the utopian American ideal, right? The answer would be radically different not possibly, definitely from a Middle Eastern ideal, right? People probably might still care about the same thing, or I don't want to involve the elites into this discussion. The average Chinese person wants the same thing as the average American, as the average Saudi person as the average Australian, right? So there are these converging points. And so sure, that diminishes the scope of the problem because we know like the rough landscape that we are kind of aiming towards, right? The landing point that we're aiming towards, which helps immensely. But there's still details to be figured out, but that's not major. The problem that arises is the approaches, the methods to reach that, right? If you were to ask the American about how to get there, the answer would be radically different from the answer of a Chinese, right? The Americans and the Chinese, both of them want peace and harmony, in progress, in abundance. But the way they arrive at that is obviously it's conditioned upon the political structure of these entities, but it's still, and sure, you can kind of, if you were to conduct a pure thought experiment, you'd remove those constraints to do a proper analysis. And we could potentially do that, right? So just add that detail. But still, the details would differ. But more than this problem, right? The different details. I think the biggest problem is that you can't control the accelerated rate of progress, right? Especially at this point in time, right? When you're building, I don't know, wheels, and when you're building trains, and when you're building airplanes and stuff like that. Well, airplanes is a bit of a example on the former side. But when you build these kind of low stakes technologies, you don't have a lot of scope for things to go wrong, right? Like, okay, train accidents happened in the 18th century, in the 17th, well, once you invented the steam engine, and then we start realizing that, okay, you know what, we're doing this wrong, let's figure it out, right? And sure, obviously there were tragedies on the way, but then we figured it out, and now millions of people travel through planes every day, right? So there are these, I'd say, relatively low consequence technologies that we built on our path to that endpoint that we've been able to have the luxury of figuring out on the go. But what we're building now, specifically referring to AGI and ASI, we won't have do-overs, right? And not just AGI and ASI, but okay, now we're getting to the sci-fi realm. But I remember this. There was such a great hoopla about this particular experiment at CERN, like I think 5-10 years back, where people were really concerned about the next experiment possibly creating a black hole in the Large Hadron Collider. Right, if that was the case, if it created a black hole in the Large Hadron Collider, that would have been the end of, well, this planet, would have been possibly the end of the solar system, right? Don't know how that would have panned out, but it would have been, well, I was going to say it would have been interesting to see, but there would have been no one to see. And you could potentially do an experiment of that sort and, like billions of solar systems, so we could even simulate it right now, so yeah. It would just be spectacular to watch it, right? Like one tiny thing that you can't even see, slowly, before you know it, I don't know what the pace of that absorption of matter would be, but it could be faster than humans could process, right? So yeah, that's an interesting sci-fi thought, by the way. Got to make a movie on that. Let me make a note of that. So there are lots of themes I want to pick up on today, but the fact that you can't control progress, right? But when you work with these kinds of high-stake technologies, let's just keep it contained to AGI because this is the most consequential piece of technology because it can create the other piece of technology, right? If you build a controllable, steerable AGI, ASI, then it can help us figure out safe ways to build a Dyson sphere, safe way to build a Neptune orbit-sized Large Hadron Collider, right? So like these things are beyond our current levels of intelligence, right? Like we just can't figure out the right materials. We just don't have that intelligence to be able to figure out those bigger questions, right? Like how do we become a culture scale 1 civilization? We just don't have the answer. There are obviously resource constraints and everything, and things take time, but some of these things are so difficult. Like we haven't figured out quantum computers, haven't figured out a lot of different things. We haven't even figured out weather and how to control it. And culture scale 1 civilization obviously would be able to control that easy breezy. So the lack of control, right? That's the biggest concern I have about this race towards accelerating towards this end state. And Silicon Valley has been blinded by this religion. Silicon Valley has this kind of cult-like nature to it, which is so ironic because when I was young, like in my mind, and I still do think that this is true to a large degree, but it's not as true as I believe it to be, right? Like Silicon Valley is the place for free thinkers, it's the place for people with contrarian views. It doesn't seem to be that way because the nature of group dynamics, and especially in an accelerating and contested age like this, is that some cults can become super powerful and Pareto's principle takes over, right? Where even there might just be 20% of people who believe in accelerationism in Silicon Valley, because these people have 80% of the distribution, like it seems to the average person that this is the belief, right, that's going around doing the blocks. And this is true for so many different things that we see, by the way, right? Like crime and news and stuff, right? Um, like 80% of the news might be about 20% of the crime, but because it's 80%, like that is what we perceive as the reality of the world. So that's generally true. But when you because Silicon Valley is going to, well, Silicon Valley and Shenzhen Valley, let's say, it's going to be building the future, right? Now, the next 10 years, the most consequential period of human history, past and future. And I do worry that if we don't have the right operating systems in place, like the Brian Johnson OS philosophy of don't die, right? Towards what end? So again, to bring it back, like I'm concerned about this blind allegiance to a philosophy without any deeper substance. Like why? Right? Why? Okay, so why do we want to accelerate? Like we're going to get to solving death. We're going to get to solving diseases. We're going to get to a post-scarcity world without AGI, right? Mind you, like it might take a lot longer, but we can still get there. Like we know how to get there. I mean, you just look at what we accomplished as species without AI in the last 100 years, the last 200 years. Well, just 100, right? Like you were less than a billion, I think, 100, 200 years back. Don't remember the exact year when we were a billion, and now there are 8 billion of us living. Most people who got food problems, they've got an obesity problem rather than not having enough food. We got like the best piece of technology that, like the kind of technology that would make someone from 18, 19, 20 think that we're like gods, right? In our hands. That's a piece of technology in our hands. And this is in the hand of probably 4-5 billion people. So, like we're at this stage and we've kind of solved a lot of the problems that we face as species, right? Like crime and not having enough food, right? That's so many. So I don't want to downplay the hunger issue, but hundreds of millions of people go to bed hungry. But that is not a food shortage problem. There's an organizational, logistical problem. With crime, that is not, we don't have the technology to protect us. There's a logistical problem. Like you could have like drones flying over the cities, and you could have like, other things that you could do on societal, social engineering things that, a lot of these problems are solved problems, but we don't have the courage to kind of take the next step because we are content with the status quo. And that is why I was bought in by the accelerationism credo in the first place, right? Like we shouldn't settle for what we've got. Like we got to move faster, right? We won't have to put up with the nonsense that elites are creating, right? And so that's why I was so enamored by it. But the problem is you can't control it, and you also got to ask, like, what is the ideal pace of growth or of progress, right? Like you could, imagine like 0 is where you're stagnated. I mean, you could have reverse progress too, but 0 is where you're stagnated. 100 is where you're going as fast as you possibly can. So you're doing and then we're probably moving at a pace of 20, I'd say, give or take. The ideal might be 30, ideal might be 50, it might be 70. It's not 100 because the closer you move towards the higher end, the more control you lose. It's also not 0, it's also not 20, right? We're not moving fast enough. But what this accelerationism is doing, though, is creating an artificial arms race. And that is a real problem. Like, this arms race could be worse than the nuclear arms race. Because that is a tangible piece of thing that we could still control. Like, a human still controls human with human drivers of wanting to the best for their countries, like be it USSR or be it the US, right? They still are driven by these similar motives. You bring ASI into the fold, and you lose all of that. Like, you've got a completely different level of thinking operating that we cannot even, like, there's no way for us to be understanding of its motivations, right, when they emerge. And they will emerge soon enough if we keep on accelerating. So this is my contention. So I can see why the AI companies want to accelerate so fast, right? And I said this in my last video, a couple of videos back, that they've got everything to gain. And when you've got everything to gain, forget about the losing part. Like, they still have their own companies and humanity to lose, which is a pretty significant loss. But when you got that kind of greed, like, that greed can overtake fear. Like, yeah, humans have done insane things when the rewards have been absolutely insane, right? Not absolutely, but pretty insane. Proportionate, right? I don't even say proportionate, but like, humans have done pretty crazy things, right? People have robbed banks and we have ventured into, the best examples would be the Europeans back in the day, 400 years back, where they would, like, Christopher Columbus's voyages, like all these ships and the Amerigo Vespucci guys and all of those people, right? Like, they went out, they didn't know if they're gonna bump into a piece of land, right? Like, they could have, and so many ships would have ended up going to that route. They might have ended up using all of the resources and they might not have been able to find a way back to civilization, right? And I'm sure that happened a lot of times. But when you got these promises like Greenland and Iceland, Greenland is the best example of this, right? Why was it named Greenland? Because the people who visited that in the first place, they wanted to kind of make this seem like this paradise, right? And plan this picture, this vision of a paradise for the people who might want to go there, because they wanted to push people there. And don't remember the motivations behind that, but that was the high level motivation of wanting that land, desolate land, to seem like a paradise. So humans can do crazy things when you put humongous rewards in front of them. In the case of AGI, who will solve ASI? Ostensibly, right? If you believe that you can control the ASI, I mean, if you can believe that you can control the ASI, then I've got a bridge to sell you. But the better quote that I like, there's this guy who tweets out a lot, like his go-to liners, that if you think that you can control the ASI, well, yeah, so the line is, if you believe superhuman AI will serve and obey us, you probably think that strippers like you, right? And so a lot of these people who are building these pieces of technology, they're not really taking the control problems, alignment problems seriously, which is really weird because, again, humans have this kind of tendency to be really smart in certain things and then be really dumb. And humans also have jagged intelligence, right? Like, we say that our current LLMs have jagged intelligence, they're like sarcastic parrots and stuff. Humans are obviously a lot better, like, we can learn on the go. But the best humans amongst us, we've had jagged intelligence, right? Like, you see the best scientists among us, they were pretty low on emotional intelligence. They might have held beliefs that were absolutely insane, right? In hindsight, like Newton being the best example, so many examples. Einstein wanting to marry his, I think he did marry his cousin, right? So you had some pretty big nutcases in terms of when you look at human geniuses. And so you don't want to take that seriously, you don't want to take that belief seriously about, you gotta look at it on face value. If you built something that you want it to have an emergence of goals inside of it, emergence of motives and drivers and planning and reasoning and being able to execute, right? That's how you build it. That's what an ESI is, and that's what they want to build. It by definition cannot be controlled, right? Like, the only thing that you can, I love the Jan LeCun framing, I love the Jeffrey Hinton framing, objective driven, right? like Jeffrey Hinton puts it in such a human way. Like the only model that we have, and there could be other models, by the way, right? Like, we obviously, like, there's only one intelligence that we dealt with, which is our intelligence, right? LLMs are not truly intelligent in the way that we mean when we say intelligence. So there could be so many different ways for intelligence to exist as an entity, for minds to exist, and for qualia to exist, right? Different ways of being that we simply wouldn't even know where to think, how to think about, because we just have had limited experience with that. Like you could have a, like I try to think of a different kind of a qualia. Like you could have like a species that, alien species that, I mean, I don't know, right? I was just gonna give an extreme example, like, it's like 200 times smarter than humans and 200 times more emotionally intelligent than humans, and we don't even know what being that mind would mean, like, right? Like we would have no way of even putting ourselves in that state. And so that's what ASI is. We essentially creating that alien intelligence, but we're creating that over here on our planet, and hoping for it to love us and nurture us. Well, Jeffrey Hinton frames it that way, which is the framing I love the most. But that's a hope, right? That is a very much a hope. Now, there's a risk. There's a 10% risk, 5% risk, whatever the risk is. My question though is, why do we want to accelerate so fast, right? Like, why would we not want to take our sweet time, prepare society, prepare people, because young people are losing their jobs, not able to find jobs. Societal discontent is rising at a rapid rate. We are heading into really dangerous waters. But AI companies, AI labs, they just care about automating the human workforce, right? Reaching ASI, reaching these artificial landmarks without really caring about what really is going to mean when we reach that and on the way there. It really, really annoys me. It annoys me because usually I don't give a damn about things happening which I can't, well, one, I can't, that don't affect me, and two, I can't do anything about. In this case, I'm building a countervailing force with the work that we're going to be doing with Hellenity, so I obviously deeply care about this. But secondly, this is going to affect me, right? I live in this world. I'm not going to go to Mars, right? I'm going, no, this is such a beautiful planet. And by the way, if we do build an ASI, like if we do build an ASI, then humanity is not safe, right? If you build an ASI without controls, without alignment, humanity is not safe wherever we go. Simple as that. But unlike being beholden to the whims of these bloody, conceited people who, for some reason, they might be so. I mean, I just have to imagine, like, how can you be so miserable that you need to accelerate out of your misery so fast, right? Like, are you really so sad in your life that you just can't find a way to be happy without going to this artificial construct of a utopia, right? But that's the question that befuddles me the most. And I know the answer, obviously. People want power, most people have this construct that, this paradise, this thing that I'll go to in 10 years, 15 years, that's where I'll be truly happy. Most people don't realize that they could literally be happy a month from today, right? If they really work on themselves. And people in Silicon Valley, they really, really lack this insight. The utopia, their utopia, the inner utopia, it literally is less than a month away if they put in the work. Like, we don't have to take the risk of destroying our entire civilization and way of living, right? Like, we don't, there's so much needless pain that they're going to put humanity through, put us through, because, again, because of the greed, because of their power-hungry nature. I'll try my best not to let that happen. But again, I'm not at that scale. I'm not at any scale to be able to, like, I'm not deluded, right? And I wish I had that. And I hope that LNC becomes that kind of a countervailing force. I'm also I also got to be realistic about the prospects of it being able to do that in the short period of time in which it needs to do that. Because if it doesn't, right? This is not me being arrogant. I just don't see enough work being done on, I wouldn't say slowing down, because again, a lot of people who say stop AI progress, slow down AI progress. Bless my goddamn soul. I say that you gotta give a convincing picture. gotta give a convincing argument. And some of the points that I made, like these are the starting points. I'm going to talk a lot more about this particular issue because humans are really bad at looking at a 10-year future, right? Exponentials and 10-year future. Like I was listening to a podcast with someone, and he'd worked both for, I think, Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman, and he was saying that one of Sam's most remarkable abilities is being able to really internalize the potential of an exponential and being able to inspire people with the exponential, right? And that's so true. We're so bad with exponentials, and so we don't know the rate at which these changes are going to take place. I, on some level, can internalize it because I tend to think about this a whole lot. Not as much as I should because I don't have the time, but it really does concern me, and it would concern anyone who spent enough time thinking about this. That we're not heading in a good direction with the arms race between US and China. Completely artificial arms race. Like if you look at the track record, by the way, the Chinese companies are open sourcing the models. They are, this is not, interesting note, by the way, I was listening to a really good discussion with this Chinese scholar. Let me find it. Yeah, a podcast where Interesting Times with Ross Duhat. His podcast has become a recent favorite of mine. Really good discussions. Definitely a big recommend. So his guest was this guy. Let me see his name. Does the future belong to China? Let me find his name. Dan Wang. And he's the author of this book, Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. And this is such a good discussion. Oh my gosh. So many lessons to learn from China, and there's so many lessons on both from on what you should do and what you shouldn't do, right? Like one of the biggest lessons is put doers in your governments, right? Like I was gonna say engineers in the government, but then you see what's happening in Silicon Valley, so I almost am defeating my own point. But the point is, okay, this needs a lot more fleshing out this particular point, right? What's happening in the US is most of the politicians, and this is also true of Europe, Keir Starmer, and God knows the other politicians, I don't even know what the other people have done in the past, but career bureaucrats, right? They don't really care about progress, they don't really care about solving problems. They care about the status quo because the status quo was able to get them to the top, and so they assume they'll keep them there, and for the most part, that assumption is true. Politicians they're dependent keeping problems as problems to be able to stay at the top, right? Politicians are the worst of humanity. But back to this discussion, right? Like if you put people who are problem solvers, the engineers, I don't mean engineers who are driven by power and who are driven by greed and all of that. Like everyone is to some extent, but there are people who are a lot more driven by power, right? Yeah, and these people tend to be the kind who, you know who I'm talking about. And China doesn't have that, right? Like the very nature of that. I'm not saying that that's a model. You can pick things from that model, but I'm not saying that model wholesale should be used by liberal democracies to be able to accelerate their own manufacturing and all of that. But like when you put problem solvers in your government, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck, a lot more, because these people thrive on solving problems, right? And the amount of problems that the Chinese have solved, like I've been obsessed with China lately, like been watching so many documentaries and just been listening to so many podcasts. Fascinating country. Like being able to raise 800 million, is it 800 million people from poverty to middle class within a generation, right? I mean, when you think of the absolute scale of it, and sure, there's so many problems, not saying that it's all hunky-dory, it's all sunshine and rainbows, so many problems, one-child policy. He was talking about how it's not, when people talk of one-child policy, we don't think of the actual implementation of it, which according to Dan Wang was one of the most brutal implementations of any policies, right? Like there's no merger or anything of that sort, but there's sterilization and there's just all sorts of really brutal methods to keep that policy intact, and that is inhuman, right? So again, like with all of those caveats, the things that China's done that just show what's potential, what's possible when you remove some of these hurdles, some of these artificial hurdles, right? You look at the infrastructure, when you look at Shenzhen, right, from a fishing backwater 30 years back to being the engineering hub of the planet. Then you look at the infrastructure, when you look at everything, right? And the Chinese are happy. That's a key measure. Right? Sure, they could be happier in a liberal democracy, but then they might not have had the prosperity as rapidly. Right? China actually kind of adopted the accelerationist credo, but there are times when you can adopt it, and there are times when you don't want to adopt it. And China has also learned its lessons. It doesn't want to go down that route anymore, right? Where it just wants to accelerate progress. It's become a lot more tempered in its approach, and for good reason. Like back in the day, where we were like human population, right? There was a time period we were rapidly expanding, like going from 1 billion to 2 billion within a few years. Like 7 to 8 billion was insane, right? Over time, though, we are close to stagnating, and over time, we're going to keep decreasing. And so, the S curve makes its way into so many different areas of human life and physics and biology and chemistry and all of computer science and all of that, right? Even AI progress to a huge degree, it's these S curves stacked on top of each other. And I think we are kind of nearing the top of this particular S curve. So I'm not going to say that we're going to enter an AI winter, but it's pretty obvious to anyone intelligent that we are slowing down our AI progress. We're not going to achieve AGI anytime soon. It could happen in 2020. I mean, if you're projecting a year back where we were on the exponential, then you would have said that, okay, 2027, but now that we're slowing down, if you extrapolate from that point onwards, it's probably 2030, 2032, which is, by the way, was my belief like a few years back. Well, it still is. But it's funny how pre-ChatGPT, that was my belief, and how brought forward by a couple of years. But I'm just thinking about whether I want to talk more about this particular subtopic, right? But I do want to be focused on what we're talking about. So, getting back to it. When you create these artificial arms race dynamics, you're putting the entire world in jeopardy. Another key point that is missed in these discussions is that we can solve a lot of the problems that we hope AGI to solve for us, right? A lot of this nonsense is about offloading our own responsibilities, like solving well-being, right? If you can't find a way to be happy yourself, if you can't figure out happiness by yourself, then if an AGI does that for you, like, is that even true happiness, right? Like, it could find the right mix of chemicals to give you, right? Like a Brave New World kind of a concoction. And that's a world that a lot of tech bros want us to move towards. But it's not well owned. And I am purist for well owned well being, right? Like solving our own problems and not offloading the responsibility to big government or to an institution or to an ASI for that matter. And in the undertone, in a lot of these discussions, is expecting the ASI to solve all problems for us so that we can live our lives on the beach and do whatever we want, right? We can literally have that life right now. There are things that we haven't solved, like death and disease being the top of the list. The point though is, we literally could solve death and disease without having a general ASI. We could build a super intelligence which is very much focused just on, which is very much trained on or focused on solving that particular problem, right? It wouldn't have any other goals, it wouldn't have any other, it wouldn't even know what other realms of knowledge are, right? It would just have been optimized to solve that particular problem. How do we solve death? How do we solve disease? And you can do that. Apart from that, all of the other problems that I see, they're very much solvable by our own efforts, if we had the will. And so I don't like the undertones, I don't like the implications of wanting to accelerate ASI so they can help us solve our problems. As for the Kardashev scale 1 and scale 2 civilizations, I also want to see 100 billion humans. I also want to see a trillion humans in the solar system and then beyond. But there's an express problem, right? More consciousness is not an express problem for which we need to kind of gamble away the future. Because the future is hundreds of trillions of humans, well, quadrillions of humans, hundreds of quadrillions of humans, right? When you look at our long future history. I don't want to gamble that away just because we didn't have the patience. If you don't have the patience, we don't even deserve that future, by the way. If we can't figure this out ourselves, we don't deserve that. So if I was a world president, or if I was a US president, no, I would never want to be that. So I'll just use a made up name. If I was a world's president, my position would be this, right? We solve death, we solve disease, first of all, put all of it into that. We solve logistics so that no person goes hungry. We solve wars, right? Again, if we expect AGI to solve wars for us, resources are not a constraint anymore, right? The problems are very much man-made at the moment. Most problems that we face. There are other problems that death and disease. There are some natural problems, and then there are some material science problems where ASI would be. Again, for that we can build a niche specific ASI. We don't need an ASI that can understand everything, and that can then its goals and drives emerge from that understanding and its own architecture, whatever how the architecture is being built, right? For us, our goals obviously come from our evolutionary history. I don't know what kind of, you can imagine different approaches. I would assume the default way the goals might emerge in an ASI. And we are not going to have like a embodied ASI, right? People are not talking about that at this point. So if it's purely digital, it wouldn't have these drives as we do, right? And so it won't be able to feel empathy, it won't be able to feel joy and connection and intimacy and all of that. Again, that creates a problem. I want embodied ASI. Because sure, embodied ASI can feel anger, it can feel wrath, it can feel hatred, it can feel bigotry, it can feel all of that. But the record shows that most humans, and we share the same architecture, most humans are good people. So it's already been too long, it's too late, I'm already feeling so sleepy. But my hope is this, that this transition that we're undergoing, this radical transition, we kind of slow things down, right? We still want to move towards that world. We still want to get to ASI. I would love to, for all sorts of reasons, I would love to have an ASI, right? Not because it can help us, not just because it can help us solve some of the most intractable problems, but because it would just intellectually, right? I just love the idea of having a superior intelligence that, we can learn from and we can grow with, right? Because we're lacking in wisdom, we are lacking in intelligence, and the two are not correlated, by the way. So it would also be interesting if the ASI would also be super wise, not just super intelligent. That's the kind of ASI that you would want to build. I don't want to use too many human concepts, human anthropocentric concepts, right? Because they just don't make any sense when you use them in these particular contexts. But it's still it's extremely essential that we get this right? So this is what we ought to do as a species. We ought to slow things down. Young people are suffering, right? People are absolutely suffering. People are not able to find meaningful relationships. We're replacing relationships with these simulacras. We are making people addicted to social platforms, to virtuality. We are taking away people's path to a better life, right? Like throughout there was a social contract which has been broken in the last couple of years. The social contract was each successive generation would have a better life, a better path to progress compared to its previous generations, right? That's been broken. Young people today highest rates of lack of housing and not having your own home, right? Not having your own, not having a path to building a fulfilling, meaningful, long-term career, right? These are really difficult things to grapple with when you're 20, 22, 21, 18. And this is what young people are being saddled with every single day right now. So my hope, and this is something I'm actually going to work towards with Elinity, right? So it's not just about building the ultimate social connection relationship platform, the ultimate connection platform, essentially. It's also about building the emotionally intelligent AI layer that helps us accomplish this, right? And act as a mission to do a lot more, right? Because there are going to be so many second order effects. If we do accomplish our first order mission, which is solving human connection, right? There's so many second order effects that we'll talk about at some other point, right? I mean, so to sum it all up, here's what I hope: that we slow things down. We still want to attain that, but we also kind of learn to, you know, have a faith in our own judgment, right? Czech bros don't have that. That's why they want to offload the decision making onto AGIs. I don't want to generalize. I mean, tech bros is not the most charitable of terms, but there is a way to undergo this transition, this 10-year transition, make it into a 20-year period where it's a lot more painless for the population, and it allows us to create steerable, controllable, aligned AI systems, right? Solves all of those problems. But we just gotta have the wisdom to know when to slow down. And yeah, so that's where I leave it at for today. Super, super sleepy. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks for this one. Take care.